I know what you're about to think. You'll imagine it's just another strange tale from a lonely gravedigger who spent too much time surrounded by graves, listening to the wind sweep the marble of the headstones. But what I'm about to reveal is neither exaggeration nor delusion. It's a memory I've carried ever since that night, clinging to my skin like the smell of wet earth that never left my clothes. This story is real, and it haunts me with every step I take, as if something had left that coffin and entered me. It was supposed to be just another ordinary night of work, the kind where solitude becomes companionship, and the silence of dawn is the only sound with which we learn to converse. But everything changed when I received an unusual proposal, a burial without a wake, without flowers, without family. A man who spoke softly, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses even at night, handed me a heavy brown envelope and said just 4 words: "Don't look at the body." That was all I had to do: dig, bury, and forget. For a while I considered refusing, but the fee offered was higher than any funeral I'd ever done in years of work. Cash, no questions asked, and one clear condition: no opening of the casket, no questions asked, just obeying. And I obeyed, as best I could, because the problem with making pacts with silence is that it takes a heavy toll when curiosity starts to scream inside us. During the transport to the oldest section of the cemetery, I felt something strange. The coffin's weight was uneven. It seemed too light to contain a body, but too heavy to be empty. And at one point, I swear by all that is holy, I heard a faint sound coming from inside. It wasn't a scream, not a whisper. It was a muffled noise, almost like the sound of nails sliding across wood. I froze. I took a deep breath. I continued, but even after burying it, something inside me wouldn't rest. It wasn't just fear. It was as if the coffin was still present, watching me even from beneath. The earth. It was as if that wood had eyes. And when I finally decided to disobey and open that lid, what I found cannot be explained in simple words. It was like looking directly into something that defies logic, faith, and even sanity itself. The image I saw inside hasn't just haunted me ever since. It chose me, and now that you're listening, perhaps it chose you too. If you think I'm exaggerating, wait until you hear who paid me, because that's where the real darkness begins. If this story has you hooked this far, it's because something has already touched you. Like the video and subscribe now before the next part catches you off guard. My name doesn't matter. What I am now is just a remnant of what I once was. For 34 years, I was a gravedigger in a small cemetery far from the town of Dover, New Hampshire. It was one of those places you don't see on the tourist map, where the trees are older than the residents and where the silence seems to have a will of its own. Truches. There was never something I chose with enthusiasm. Life simply pushed me through that rusty iron gate, and I stayed. A lonely night shift with cold tools, failing flashlights, and the constant feeling that you're never completely alone. Over time, loneliness becomes part of the uniform. Over the years, I've buried more people than I can remember. I've seen families torn apart by grief, too many coffins lowered into graves dug by tired hands. I learned not to ask questions, not to form attachments, and above all, to maintain emotional distance. It was as if each shovelful of dirt I threw over the bodies also removed me from the world of the living. And honestly, I preferred it that way. Living people scare me more than the dead. At least, that's what I believed, until that night. Dover Cemetery is divided into 3 sections. The new section, where the graves still receive fresh flowers, the middle section, where the grass is already beginning to swallow the names, and the old section, which seems to have been forgotten even by death itself. It was there that everything happened. That section always bothered me. It was too cold, even on warm days. The trees didn't move in the wind, and occasionally I heard things I couldn't explain. but I never took it seriously. I thought it was just fatigue, imagination. Until that service came along. Working at night in that place required more than physical strength. It required controlling one's mind, taming one's own. Shadow. Many times I heard sounds behind me, and when I turned around, there was nothing. But nothing compared to what I felt the moment I received that envelope. It was as if the paper burned in my hands. I should have refused. But life, with all its debts, overdue bills, and the loneliness that had become a companion, spoke louder. And when you live on the edge of invisibility, any value that acknowledges your existence seems too tempting to ignore. I accepted, and that sealed my fate. But what was inside that envelope? It was the kind of thing not even the cemetery itself would dare keep secret. And by the time I found out, it was too late to turn back. I was in the shed, sorting out the tools I'd used that morning, when I heard the muffled rumble of tires on the gravel driveway. It was unusual for someone to arrive after 10 o'clock at night, especially without warning. The engine cut off gently, and the silence that followed was so thick I could hear my own heart pounding in my chest. I walked to the gate with my flashlight in hand, flickering it until the light reached a large, old black car with no visible license plates. The glow of its muted headlights reflected off the damp varnish of the mortuary chapel. And then he got out. The man wore a long overcoat even on the warm summer night. His hands were covered with thin gloves, his face partially hidden beneath a hat and sunglasses, a detail that immediately gave me goosebumps, as the moon was already high and there was no reason to hide my eyes in that darkness. He walked with precise steps, unhurried, as if he knew exactly where he was and what he wanted. I remained silent, waiting for him to say something, and he finally spoke, his voice deep and dry, as if he had sand in his throat. "I need you to bury a body. Now." No questions asked, and without opening the casket. He then extended his arm and handed me a thick envelope, sealed with red wax. I hesitated for a moment, but he held his arm outstretched. Firmly, I took the envelope and felt the weight of the money inside, bills still damp from being so new, folded with precision. He didn't explain anything. He simply pointed to the back of the car, where, covered by a black tarp, lay a dark wooden coffin, unlike any I had ever seen. It was narrower, with strange carvings and no identification, no handle, no name. Everything about it exuded secrecy. They'll bury him in the old sector, a deep grave, no record, and let this end today. Before I could answer, he added, "If you do exactly as you said, twice as many will be here tomorrow. But if you try to see what you weren't called to see, well, you don't want that." The way he said those words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning, cold, direct, calculated. He knew something I didn't, and that, in itself, was terrifying. I swallowed hard and nodded silently. I couldn't take my eyes off the coffin. Something in that wood seemed to pulse, as if it held a secret about to be revealed. But I obeyed anyway, at least for that moment. But in that profession, you learn to recognize when a body's weight is wrong. And that night, the weight was way off. What was inside that coffin was not just someone's body. And what this man gave me was the beginning of something that not even death could end. But nothing, absolutely nothing, has left me as uneasy as what happened on the way to the grave. Because it was there that everything began to unfold. But it was on the way to the grave, with the wind still and the coffin creaking slightly, that I realized I was no longer alone, and whatever was inside seemed to know exactly who I was. The coffin was placed on the back of the hearse we used for internal journeys. Even though it was a dense wooden model, the weight felt wrong. It wasn't light enough to be empty, nor heavy enough to carry someone of normal size. The distribution was also odd. The right side sagged more than the left, as if the contents had been displaced, compressed into an abnormal position. I tried not to think about it. The mind plays tricks when the environment helps. But every time I looked at the canvas, something inside me tightened. It was as if the silence around me had thickened. Even the crickets stopped chirping when I passed through the gate separating the sectors. The route to the old section was always the darkest in the cemetery. Tall trees obscure the moonlight, and the dirt path never seemed to dry completely. The cart creaked with every meter, the sound mixing with the rustle of dry leaves under the wheels. I was alone. No other staff were on duty, as if they'd deliberately avoided this shift. When I reached the farthest part of the old section, I parked beneath an old oak tree, its roots protruding from the earth like the veins of a body buried alive. And it was there, as I turned off the engine, that I heard the first sound coming from inside the coffin. It was subtle, almost inaudible. A grinding sound, as if something were moving very slowly against the wood inside. At first, my body froze. I didn't breathe. I stood still, trying to convince myself it was just the natural creaking of the wood adapting to the change in temperature. But the noise returned, a light, rhythmic scratching like thin nails touching the inside of the lid. Sweat trickled down my back, even in the cool early morning air. My eyes fixed on the canvas, which remained motionless, but my instinct screamed. Something is wrong. I did what any professional accustomed to the unpredictable would do. I opened the toolbox and began digging. I pretended to ignore the sound, but with each movement of the shovel, I felt as if I were being watched. The sensation was physical, like a presence behind my neck pressing on the air. With each inch of earth I removed, the noise inside the coffin seemed closer. It didn't increase in volume, but in intent, as if the thing inside knew I wouldn't obey for much longer. When I finally finished digging the grave and prepared the ropes to lower the coffin, it felt heavier than before. A dead weight, not made of flesh and bone, but something no one should carry. And it was at that moment, as I adjusted the ropes, that I felt the vibration, a subtle tremor coming from the wood. It wasn't my imagination, something inside was breathing. And I knew deep down that it wasn't over yet, because what came next would make the very ground refuse to hide it. With the hole dug and sweat already dripping down my neck, even in the cold early morning, I began the process of lowering the coffin. The ropes slid with difficulty, as if the object resisted its final fate. The wood creaked again, this time louder, and for a moment I swore I heard a muffled sigh coming from within. I froze for a second. The sound stopped. I took a deep breath, stepped back, and forced myself to think logically. Maybe it was just the friction of the boards. Maybe. But nothing that night had behaved normally. I looked around and no longer saw the man in the trench coat. He'd said he'd stay there, watching the proceedings from a distance, but he'd disappeared. I didn't hear the car start, nor did I see any sign of movement in his direction. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. It should have bothered me more, but at that point my mind was so overwhelmed that his absence felt like a relief. At least, that's what I thought. When I finally positioned the coffin at the bottom of the grave, a chill ran down my spine. The earth around it seemed darker than usual, as if it had been recently disturbed. Even though I knew there hadn't been a burial there in months, I began to fill the grave quickly, but respectfully, respecting the process. Each shovelful of dirt felt heavier than the last, and my body began to feel a fatigue that wasn't physical. It was as if the very atmosphere around me grew denser, the air thicker, the sounds muffled. And then, as I smoothed the last mound of dirt, I heard something that paralyzed me completely, a dull thud, once, twice, three, coming from beneath the earth. I closed my eyes and held the shovel tightly in my hands, trying not to freak out. The sound ceased as if it had never been. No movement, no voices, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees again. I didn't go back to check. Bury and forget. That was the order, and I obeyed. I stepped firmly onto the grave and took a deep breath, pretending everything was under control. But inside, something had broken. The air around me was no longer the same. It was colder, denser. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I felt observation. I walked back to the warehouse without looking back. I left my tools haphazardly, washed my hands hurriedly, and locked myself in the administrative office. I sat there for long minutes, trying to find a rational explanation for what I had witnessed. But there was no logic. Nothing made sense. And even inside, protected by walls and locks, I could still hear it, as if the thing hadn't stayed underground, but had come with me. And that's exactly what forced me to return to the tomb, because deep down, I knew something was wrong. And when I returned, I would open the coffin. That night seemed endless. Time had frozen in a state of restlessness, as if the world had held its breath along with me. I tried to sleep on the small sofa in the office, but every time I closed my eyes, the sound of those knocks haunted me. Like a persistent echo in my mind. 3 sharp knocks, a pause, then absolute silence. But the kind of silence that screams inside your head, an emptiness so intense it makes noise. Something in that coffin hadn't rested. Something didn't want to be ignored. I slept for little more than 20 minutes before waking with a start. Sweat soaking my shirt, and the insistent sound of the shed door slamming shut, as if someone outside was trying to break in. I jumped up startled, gasping, but when I opened the door, no one was there. Only wind, a cold, dense wind that seemed to come straight from the newly filled grave. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and my legs wavered. Returning to the grave was a nauseating thought, but the feeling that something had been buried wrong or alive kept me from breathing properly. Guilt gnawed at me like silent rust, and against my better judgment, I gave in. I grabbed the shovel, strapped the flashlight to my wrist and set off, alone, stomping through. The slippery mud, guided only by an obsession I could no longer control. The path to the old section seemed longer than before, as if the cemetery had stretched out overnight. The trees, once motionless, now seemed to follow my path with elongated shadows and crooked branches that intertwined above me, like the claws of something stalking me. And deep down, a part of me knew, if I turned back, perhaps there would still be salvation. But I didn't come back. When I reached the grave, the mound of earth didn't look the same as the one I'd left. The surface was sunken in the center, as if something had moved beneath it. I took a deep breath and began digging quickly, my hands trembling, heedless of logic, heedless of what I might find. I just wanted to dispel that damn doubt that had been hammering at me since the first knock. Minute after minute, the smell of damp earth mingled with the strong odor that began to rise from the bottom of the grave. It wasn't the normal smell of decay. It was something older, denser, almost chemical, a mixture of dried blood and rotting wood with something metallic at the bottom. When I finally reached the coffin lid, I stopped. The wood was different, more swollen, with marks that seemed to be made from the inside out, as if desperate hands had been pounding on it for hours. My hands froze, but I continued. I unlocked the latches and slowly began to lift the lid. The hinge creaked loudly, the sound piercing the night like a muffled scream. The flashlight's beam wavered as it revealed inch by inch the interior of that damn box. At first, everything seemed too dark to see, but then my eyes began to adjust, and when the beam of light found what was inside, my entire body froze. I fell to my knees, my stomach churning, and a dizzying sensation gripped my head. I couldn't scream, I couldn't think, I could only stare. Because what was inside wasn't exactly a body. And worse than seeing that was realizing that I recognized him. What I saw inside that coffin wasn't an image that fades with time, nor with prayer, nor with drink. It was a face that had passed before me once, months ago, at another wake. And it wasn't the kind of ordinary face, the kind that fades as the days pass. It was hers, Alice Thurman, daughter of the pastor of the neighboring community. She had died under strange circumstances after a fire in the family home, according to the records. I had prepared the grave myself. I remember every detail. The green stone necklace she wore, the scar on the left side of her jaw, and the lilac dress her mother insisted she wear. And there she was again. Same dress, same scar, same necklace. But her body wasn't the same. It didn't look dead. Her skin was less rigid than it should have been. Her eyes, even closed, felt pressed inward, as if something were still trying to open them. Her hands, sewn to her chest with dark thread, formed an uncomfortable, almost forced position. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew it wasn't a delusion. What I was seeing was real. I began to tremble, not just from the sight, but because I realized they'd hidden it on purpose. Someone had dug up Alice. They'd disturbed her body, changed the coffin, removed records, and done everything so no one would notice. No one except me. But why? What was in that body that justified all this effort, all this theatrics? I remembered the first funeral, how the coffin had been too light that day too. And a disturbing question came to me. Had I even buried anyone at all? Or was it just part of a much larger ritual, of which I was merely a blind part? The truth began to jumble in my head, and the more I tried to organize my thoughts, the more I felt I was sinking into something beyond my comprehension. I slammed the lid shut and stepped back, nearly tripping over the edge of the grave. The flashlight fell from my hand, and darkness swallowed everything in an instant. The only thing echoing inside me was the certainty that this was no ordinary burial, and the scariest thing of all, what I would still find inside that coffin, attached to her mouth. After that early morning, nothing returned to normal. What I saw inside that coffin, Alice Thurman's stitched-up body, the necklace stained with a dark substance, and the invisible gaze that seemed to follow me even with my eyes closed, stuck in my mind like a scar that doesn't bleed, but throbs. I tried to pretend nothing happened. I went home, took a cold shower, closed all the windows, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come, and when I finally closed my eyes for a few minutes, I woke to a noise coming from the kitchen. A whisper that called my name. Awake or not, it didn't make sense. I've lived alone for years in a remote house, and I've never been one for hallucinations. But that morning, I found all the cabinets open, the porch light on, something I'm absolutely certain I'd turned off, and one of the back doors unlocked. I tried to rationalize, blame it on fatigue, stress, maybe even a mild freak-out because of what I saw. But it was different. It wasn't a common sensation. It was as if something had come with me that morning, as if part of what was in that coffin had stuck to my skin or my soul. I returned to the cemetery the next day as if nothing had happened, but everything was wrong. Tools I'd left stored away were out of place. One of the shovels was found on top of Alice's grave, even though I was sure I'd left it inside the locked shed. And strangest of all, 3 employees had called in the early hours of the morning to resign, citing bad feelings and things they didn't want to see anymore. This put me on alert. It wasn't just me. Something was spreading. That same night, the cemetery radio, which is rarely used, turned on by itself and began emitting static, interspersed with barely audible whispers. The frequency changed on its own, as if someone were trying to communicate something. And then Amidst those white noise voices, I heard the phrase that chilled my blood. "You shouldn't have seen it." I left the radio on. I needed to make sure I wasn't going crazy. I grabbed the recorder we used for shift logs and started recording everything. But the more I tried to explain out loud what was happening, the more the atmosphere around me changed. The air grew thick, heavy, as if every word was interfering with something that didn't want to be mentioned. The wind died. The trees grew still, and the feeling of being watched returned, full force. It was then, during one of my night patrols, that I passed near the old section and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. On Alice's grave, there were fresh footprints, small, bare, and they were heading toward the warehouse, but nothing could prepare me for what I would find when I reviewed the security cameras that same night. In the cemetery's security room, where we keep an old monitor connected to an obsolete recording system with cameras distributed across the 3 sectors, I sat alone, flashlight still hanging from my wrist, feeling my heart pounding to the rhythm of a memory I desperately wanted to erase from my mind. The image of the footprints in the soft earth of the grave was still clear in my eyes, as if the clay hadn't just recorded someone's passage, but rather imprinted the presence of something that should never have returned from the world of the dead. The tracks reached as far as the shed door, but didn't go any further. They simply vanished, as if the thing had evaporated into thin air, or worse, as if it had passed through the structure without needing to open any doors. With my eyes fixed on the burnt-out phosphorus screen of the monitor, I fast-forwarded to the previous night's recording, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything began to unravel. I rewound the tape to 2:17 a.m. The cameras in the old section, even in black and white, captured the humid environment well, shrouded in a thick mist that descended between the trees like a living curtain. At first, there were only shadows drifting in the wind, leaves moving slowly, and no sign of human activity. But at a certain point, a figure began to take shape among the tombs. It didn't walk with steps. There was no stumbling, no hesitation. The figure simply glided between the mausoleums, as if the ground offered no resistance. It wore something that, even distorted by the camera's interference, still clearly resembled the lilac dress, now darkened, soiled with mud, torn at the hem, and stuck to the body by the humidity. Her hair, long and disheveled, covered part of her face, but even so, there was no doubt it was Alice. She stopped before the grave, where I had buried her not once, but twice. She remained still, silent, her head tilted slightly to the side at an angle that would be anatomically impossible for any conscious human being. For long seconds, she made no movement. She simply stood there, as if listening to something coming from beneath the earth, or perhaps waiting for an answer that would never come. But then, slowly, she began to walk, or rather, to be guided. Her bare feet shuffled unsteadily, and her body movement seemed uncoordinated, as if pulled by invisible strings. And even with her head down, I knew her eyes were open, because even through the fixed lens, the low resolution and the distance, I felt her gaze on me. It wasn't an illusion. It was as if she knew I was watching, as if she'd been waiting for this very moment, as if the entire act were being staged just for me. The recording continued, and around 2:38 a.m., the floodlights in the old sector began to fail. One by one, the streetlights went out like candles being suffocated by invisible fingers. The camera's image rapidly lost definition until it became nothing more than a dark blur. The screen went completely black, but the recording didn't stop. The system still captured ambient sound, and that was precisely what made those 2 minutes the most terrifying of my life. First, there were 3 dry, spaced knocks, like the ones I heard when I first buried the coffin. Then a deep, continuous sound, like something heavy being dragged over the gravel, not quickly, but deliberately slowly, as if the presence itself wanted to be heard, registered, felt. Finally, a breath, slow, deep, interrupted by small pops of saliva and a dry throat. The kind of sound you only hear when someone is very, very close. The breathing was so clear, it seemed to be coming from inside the room. At that moment, I stood up violently, slammed the monitor shut, and braced myself on the edge of the desk to keep from falling. My body was in shock, and my heart felt like it was trying to escape from my temples. My mind whirled as if trying to deny what my eyes and ears had already confirmed. But there was no more room for denial. There was no longer any room for rationalization. She had risen from the grave, and worse, she knew exactly where to find me. This was no longer a suspicion whispered by fear. It was a truth carved into the flesh, filmed by a camera that, ironically, was supposed to protect, but now served only as a mirror of the impossible. The next morning, the recording was gone. The system, which records everything on rotating tapes, should keep files for at least 72 hours. But when I tried to play it back, the screen showed only a signal. A failure. No files from that night were recorded on the digital recording. When removed, the tape was completely blank. I took the contents to an outside technician who assured me there was nothing recorded there, as if the equipment had failed or never been used. But I knew what I had seen. I remembered every second, every look, every sound, and the only possible conclusion was that the entity didn't want to leave a trace. It had allowed me to watch, just me, as a final provocation, like someone opening the door just enough to show that, if it wanted to, it would have entered long ago. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that it was possible to bury the fear again along with the body, but that was no longer an option. The presence had materialized. It wasn't just back, it was moving, and it had made it clear in every way possible that it wouldn't leave until it finished what it started. I was the next link in a chain that didn't begin with me, nor would it end there, and something told me that if I didn't do something, anything to stop it, the darkness wouldn't just take me, it would live through me. But what would come next? What awaited me on the next dig? It wasn't a body, it was a secret sewn into the flesh, a living message that still pulsed. And he called me by name. I had already dug up that coffin once, but something inside me told me it wasn't enough. The camera footage, the whispers picked up on the radio in the wee hours of the morning, Alice's figure walking among the graves in the old section, and the muffled heartbeats coming from inside the grave. Everything indicated there was something beyond what met the eye, beyond logic, beyond death. I was no longer dealing with a simple body, nor a simple burial error. This was older, deeper, darker than I could conceive. It was as if each piece was being placed before me by some force that wanted somehow to make me understand, or drive me mad. And at that point, it was no longer mere curiosity. It was instinct, survival. Because even though I couldn't understand it rationally, something inside me screamed that the answer to all of this, to the silence, to the presence, to the constant fear, was inside that box, literally inside. I returned to the old section in a heavy, humid, starless dawn. It was as if the sky itself had refused to watch what was about to happen. The wind, once steady, now moved in erratic eddies, whistling between the graves as if whispering prayers in a forgotten language. I carried a shovel, a new flashlight, and a pair of pliers, as if these objects could protect me from what deep down I knew I was about to face. As I approached the grave, I immediately noticed that the earth was different. The grave seemed to have sunk deeper, as if something from within had burrowed outward. The edges were uneven, the clay darker, wet and churned, giving off an ancient smell, as if bones much older than Alice's own body had been disturbed. This paralyzed me for a few seconds. I hadn't yet touched the earth, and yet I felt as if I were already inside it. Even though I was trembling, I began to dig quickly. The knocks I'd heard earlier didn't repeat, but the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me was even more intense. It wasn't the kind of presence you sense intuitively, but a physical oppression, as if the air around me had been replaced by something dense, cold and aware. When the shovel touched the wood again, I felt the same chill run up my spine, and with my heart pounding, I descended into the grave. The lid was warped as if it had been pushed in from the inside. The screws were loose and the wood seemed bulging. But what paralyzed me most were the scratches inside. When I looked closely, I saw they weren't cracks or damage. They were inscriptions. Words scratched with nails or teeth. Desperate messages etched from the inside out. One of them stood out more clearly than all the others, repeated over and over on the side of the coffin, "I am not alone." I took a deep breath and opened the lid. Alice's body was different. It wasn't just natural decomposition that altered her appearance, but something more, as if her face had acquired its own expression. Her eyes were closed but pressed together, as if something inside was still struggling to stay there. Her hands, which had previously rested crossed over her chest, were now spread apart, as if they had tried to move. And her mouth was the worst. It was sewn shut with thick black thread, with rough, irregular stitches, and between her closed lips, a small piece of paper protruded, held in place by the last stitch. My body froze. It hadn't been there before. Someone, or something, had disturbed that body after the burial. With disgust and dread, I used the pliers to cut the stitches. With each break in the thread, a putrid smell escaped, thick as smoke. The flesh creaked, as if alive, and even with my stomach churning, I continued. When I finally managed to part my lips, I hesitantly dug in and pulled out the folded piece of paper. It was still damp, soaked with dried blood and saliva. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was fragile, shaky, but each word seemed to have been written with urgency and desperation. The message was short but definitive. If you're reading this, it means I failed. They are burying the marked. Don't look at the face. Don't read the name. Don't say the name. If you opened it, you're next. Bury it again, quickly, before he realizes you've seen him. The letter ended abruptly, with just 2 letters scrawled in the bottom corner. A.T. Alice Thurman. It was from her. It had been written inside the coffin, probably when she was still alive, bound, gagged, trying to leave a final warning for whoever might find her body. Me. And now, every line of that letter was branded inside me, like an invisible scar. She hadn't just been buried conscious, it had been sealed like a warning, like a barrier, and I, by opening it, had broken that seal. In an attempt to remedy what could no longer be undone, I replaced the paper, closed Alice's mouth as best I could, and pushed the lid back on, tightening the loose screws with my bare hands. I threw dirt over the coffin like a madman, almost begging for it to be enough to contain whatever was manifesting. But deep down, I knew none of that mattered anymore. The evil had already been unleashed, and I was the bearer of the new. Message? The link, the living witness to a secret no one was supposed to know. That night, I returned home with the distinct feeling that I was not alone. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, and every shadow cast in the corners of the room made me turn my head as if I were being followed. But it was the next morning that true despair set in. On the kitchen table, there was a new envelope. It had no return address, no wax seal. It was just a thick piece of yellowed paper, folded once. And inside, written in the same shaky handwriting, were just 4 words. "You are now the door." I dropped the note, trembling, unable to comprehend the true meaning of those words. But one thing was certain. I no longer had the right to return to normality. Something had chosen me, something was crossing over, and now it was for me. I tried to act normally in the days that followed, as if it were possible to simply forget the whole thing. I buried the body again, sealed the lid, covered the grave. With twice as much soil, cleaned the surrounding marks, and even erased my name from that night's service report. I wanted to believe that by burying everything once more, I would be closing the door to this nightmare. But doors like that aren't closed with dirt. They remain ajar, waiting for the next victim to walk through. That morning, I came home early. I locked every window, every entrance, took the phone off the hook, and turned off the porch light. I did what anyone would do when they sensed something invisible approaching. I hid, but whatever was behind me had already entered, and I only realized this when I saw, on the kitchen table, something that made me drop everything on the floor. It was the necklace. That same green stone necklace Alice wore on the day of the first funeral. It was there exactly as I remembered, untouched, glistening in the dim light of the sink lamp. I never removed it, never picked it up. It must have been underground. My palms began to sweat, and my breath caught. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no forced doors, and yet something had been there. Something had left it like a message, as if to say, I know where you live, and I'm closer than you think. I stood still for a few minutes, staring at the cursed object on the wood, while I listened to a sound coming from the room. A slow sound, like wood creaking under the weight of someone barefoot, or something creeping slowly so as not to be noticed. My body froze. I grabbed the flashlight I'd brought from the cemetery and walked silently to the bedroom door. It was ajar. Light from the hallway leaked in, partially illuminating the floor. I saw something dark near the bed. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. But when I pushed the door open with my foot, there was nothing. Nothing visible, at least. Only the cold, a dense cold, not coming from the weather, but from a presence, an energy that pressed against the bones, that whispered without, making a sound that paralyzed without touching. It was in that moment that I understood. This was never about Alice. She was just a medium, a vessel, a portal, and now the one who had seen was me. The one who had read the message was me. The one who had broken the seal was me. And no matter how much I tried to run, to hide, to forget, I had been marked. But what completely knocked me off my feet was what I found under the bed that night. Something that made me realize this wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. I leaned over slowly and shone my flashlight into the space, expecting to see only dust or perhaps a forgotten box. But what I found was a piece of paper folded with surgical precision. As I unrolled it, my hands trembled. It was a black and white photograph. In it, I saw myself, younger, holding a shovel in the old section of the cemetery. The date in the bottom corner was 23 years ago. But what frightened me most wasn't even that. It was the fact that, clearly visible behind me in the photo, was the same carved coffin I had buried just days before. That image couldn't possibly exist. At the time, I had never seen that coffin, much less that man. Because yes, he was in the photo too. The man in the overcoat, standing in the shade of a crooked tree, as if observing everything from afar. There was no way it could have been captured by chance. That photo was a warning, a reminder, or perhaps a sentence. That night I didn't sleep, and in the following nights, sleep became a rare visitor. I began to hear footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices coming from the basement I never used. The mirrors in the house began to fog up on their own. The lights flickered every time I tried to say her name out loud. And the necklace disappeared from the table the next morning, without anyone else having entered it. But on the third day, it reappeared, inside my pillow. as if it wanted to constantly remind me that I was no longer in control. I started investigating the name of the man who hired me, but no roadside cameras recorded the car entering or leaving, no license plates, no sign that he actually existed, at least to the outside world. And the coffin. When I returned to the cemetery to try to dig it up again, it simply wasn't there anymore. The grave was empty. No trace of anything having been buried, no disturbed soil, not the slightest proof that that night of horror had actually happened. And that was the most maddening part, because now I had no way to prove I wasn't crazy. That's when the nightmares began. Always the same. I'm walking in the old section of the cemetery and I hear a whisper. I don't understand what's being said, but it guides me to a grave with no name. When I open the tomb, I see myself inside, eyes open, smiling. I always wake up in the same spot, sweating, with the metallic taste of fear in my mouth. Since that day, I've avoided places with mirrors, half-open doors, and any kind of old photographs. I carry with me the certainty that I'm no longer alone, that there's something or someone accompanying me. I don't know if I'm the only one touched by this. Maybe not. Maybe you now listening to this story have also been chosen. And if that's the case, if some part of your house is already colder than the rest, if you notice the necklace appearing in dreams, or if a black and white photograph of an unmarked grave appears in some unexpected corner of your memory, then know this: it wasn't just a story, it was a warning, because some things don't want to be buried, they want to be remembered, and when they're forgotten, they come back to find those who tried to silence them. Under the bed, covered in dust and wrapped in a dark cloth, was an envelope. The same kind of envelope I'd received that first night in the cemetery. Brown, thick, sealed with red wax. But there was no sender, no mark, no name, nothing but a new note scrawled by hand on the back. You opened the first box. Now you need to bury the next ones. My stomach churned. I felt a chill run down my spine like an icy blade. The mere presence of that object there, inside my home, without any logical explanation, was confirmation that I had been pulled into something much bigger, and there was no way out. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a list, names, dates, coordinates. Some names I knew, former cemetery employees, old townspeople who vanished without a trace, people who, I now understand, were buried without ever having actually died. Other names were unfamiliar until I reached the last one on the list. It was mine, and next to it, a date, the date of the next day. Now you understand why I decided to record this story, because maybe by the time you hear me, I'll no longer be here. Maybe I'll have become just another name on the next list. Just another coffin someone will bury under the orders of a man who appears in the middle of the night, promising silence and money. Maybe someone will receive the same envelope, and if that's the case, I can only leave one warning: don't open it. No matter how much your curiosity stings, no matter how much everything inside you begs for an explanation, don't open it. And if you've heard this story this far, know that this was just the first part of something much deeper and darker. There's something much bigger buried behind all of this, and I'll continue to reveal it, name by name, secret by secret. If you have the courage to unearth this truth with me, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because the next story will make you question the depths of the wickedness of the living and the silence of the dead.